All right, so let's talk about test-driven development, or TDD in short. TDD is pretty important. Now, notice I didn't say it's extremely important. I said it is pretty important. There is a reason. For any software project, there are different stages. And it depends on how early the product is, and also depends on the nature of the company. But imagine that we're working at a startup and we have 0 customers. At that stage, let's say that's the stage 1 of a software project. Which one do you think is more important? How fast we build things, the speed, or how reliable our product is to our customers, or reliability? So if you had to pick between speed of development, how fast we're building and launching features, and how reliable the code base is in terms of the number of bugs customer find, which one do you think is more important when we're a startup and we don't have any customers? Speed is definitely really important, right? If you don't have any customers, who cares if your site's down for a few hours, right? You prioritize over features, over the speed, over the velocity of our engineering team, rather than, hey, we want to have 99.99% uptime. Okay, so speed is really important. So when speed is really important, typically, or I would say almost always, you don't want to focus on test-driven development, because that's going to slow the team down by a factor of 2 to 3 times. Now, there may be some arguments against it, but I'm just going to go with my opinion that in the beginning, at that stage, building features fast is really important, because you don't have any customers, so you can afford more mistakes. But not only that, all products go through evolutions. So what you built on evolution 1 may be thrown away at evolution 5 or evolution 7, or sometimes they call it pivots. But as the product evolves, and as we find out more about the needs of the customer, you may find that all the things that you worked on in the beginning, they're no longer relevant. So the code base just becomes more complex and kind of messy, that you may have to throw away your code base and start all over again. And this is very common in a new project where you started with certain specs in the beginning. The specs change quite a bit over time, and after a few years, your code base is so messy that you have to just go and start over. In fact, some entrepreneurs would argue that's what you just have to expect what happens as a given, because the scope changes quite a bit. So, and I've seen that done multiple times in the projects that I've started, in the startups that I advised, and so forth. Okay, so anyway, stage 1, when speed is really important, you may not want to work on TDD or test-driven development. There is stage 2 where you get customers, and now reliability is also important now. Okay, and this is where you want to introduce some TDD. Stage 3 of the project is where you got a lot of customers. The product is working. You nailed it. You nailed the product market fit, and your product is working quite well, and you have paying customers. At that stage, at stage 3 of the project, you cannot afford a lot of mistakes. You don't want the site to go down for a few hours. You don't want the customers to find bugs and report to you. You want to have a rigorous QA process, and to be able to identify bugs in advance and catch them on the staging server, instead of customers telling you, oh, I went to your site and found these bugs. That's embarrassing. That's a bad customer experience, and we want to avoid that. So at stage 3 of the project, test-driven development becomes very, 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 very important. Okay, so anyway, this is why TDD, you got to look at what stage of the project am I at, right? If I'm building something from scratch and there's no customers, TDD is only going to slow you down by a factor of 2 to 3 times, right? For example, if I'm building a project, whatever I can do, let's say if I can do something in a day, if I have to do it using TDD, I may end up writing 2 to 3 times more code for the test than the actual code for the features. It's very common. So instead of taking me 1 day to build the features, it may actually take me 3 days and so forth. So you got to look at which stage of the project, it is. And if you're jumping into a project 3 or level 3 project, you really have to know TDD. If you don't, your manager is not going to like you. If you're working on level 1, don't insist that everything has to be done in TDD, because, hey, 2 months later, everything you worked on may be thrown away. As we find out some new information about the customers, as the business model changes and so forth. So anyway, that's why we got to be flexible. So test-driven development, in a nutshell, is where you're writing actually a function to see if your functions are working the way that it should. So you say, hey, for this function, run this function. We're expecting this function, given these parameters or arguments, are expecting these values. Does it actually do that? All right, so it's basically a function to test the function. So you write these tests and say, hey, for this function, if I give you this, I expect this. Is that what is returned? Good, thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay, so basically that's at a high level what test cases are. That you can write test cases to test your models, controllers, and even the view. You can use tools such as Selenium. There are all these other tools that are available that you can use to test what the users would actually do. So you can say, okay, browser, well, open up this browser. I want you to open up Chrome version, blah, 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 Firefox, blah, 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 Edge, blah, blah, blah version. And then click here, fill this out, wait 2 seconds, and then click here. And then do you now expect, and do you have in your HTTP response this word, or does this come up, right? So you can write test cases to write theoretical scenarios. For example, registration. Click here, type this, and then click on register. But do not put in the password. Hey, does it show the error message up on the top? Does it actually go to this URL and display this error message? What if you put in this email address, but it's not a valid email address, and you click on register? Hey, does it show an error message called blah, blah, blah? Okay, well, let's put in a password, but let's put in 2 different passwords in password and confirm password. Hey, does it produce an error message once you click on submit, that, the passwords do not match? Okay, what if I actually do blah, blah, blah? Maybe I put in the first name, but not the last name. So you can imagine, even for a simple registration, I can easily come up with maybe 20 test cases. Missing first name, missing last name, invalid email address, too long of an email address, and so forth. And I can also, have one where I provide the correct one and see if it actually goes to the right URL with the right information and so forth. So notice how in that example with the registration, if I'm writing test cases, you can write 20 test cases just for the registration, right? And you can write a lot of test cases. So usually for when you jump into a project, find out how many test cases are we expected to write. Are we expected to just write test cases for some of the most important features, or is this a level 3 project where we have to write test cases for almost every single thing that we can come up with? Especially if you're doing continuous deployment, you want to have a lot of test cases. If you're on level 2 project, where now there are customers and you're starting to write test cases, usually you only write test cases for some of the critical features. Okay, so here's a funny story. I've heard of companies where they wrote so many test cases that in order to run all the test cases, it takes several weeks. Okay, so that's kind of a bad scenario. They almost wrote too many test cases. And there are ways that you can spread out the load so that instead of one computer running all test cases, you can kind of, delegate and have maybe 10 different computers running the test simultaneously. But anyway, that's a little bit beyond the scope, but that could be arranged using Dockers and containerization. But that's kind of an extreme example where you make commit to your code base and maybe have to wait 2 weeks to see if all of your test cases pass. So normally it's not done like that. It should be done within minutes. So minutes after you submit a code, pull request or merge the code, or if you're running the test case yourself, within minutes, it runs maybe hundreds of test cases and tells you, okay, 100, test cases have all passed and so forth. Now, one of the important concepts about TDD I do want to highlight is the ideal TDD approach is before you actually write the feature, you write the test cases first. Because if you didn't build out the feature and you write the test cases, and if you run the test cases and if the test cases say, oh, everything went well, you know something is wrong, right? Because you haven't built out the features. So typically with TDD, the right approach is you write the test, you run the test, you make sure it fails, right? Because you didn't write the features. And then you write the features and you run the test again and you then see if the test passes, right? So that's kind of like the red-green principle where, hey, before you write the feature, write the test first. Hey, make sure it fails. And then write the features and then make sure the test now pass, okay? So the assignments in this course will help you get more familiarity with writing test cases, unit tests, using Selenium to do integration tests, and it will give you a taste of how to write these test cases, and then we'll also get you some exposure to continuous integration so you can get this to the next step. Okay? All right, good luck.